Hello, everyone. I don't know if you guys can hear me or see me yet. If you can, put something in the chat so I know you can hear me and see me and everything's coming through clear. Please note if there's any kind of feedback or anything, that way, um, you know, you'll be able to hear me okay. Am I getting feedback? No? All right. Can you hear me? Hmm. I think something might be going on with the internet here. The stream is weak. Hmm. All right, I see it. Hmm. Where's my stream issue? Hold on, guys. I am examining why my stream is working slow. Okay, stream is good now. Can everybody hear me? Can you hear me okay? Hello, hello? Okay. Hello, hello? Any feedback? Hmm. Hold up. Okay, good. Let me do something real here. All right. The stream, for whatever reason, is being really picky. I'm not sure exactly why it keeps saying video output low. It should not be doing that. The internet's working full blast. The computer's got 16 gigs of memory going, so I'm not exactly sure why it's doing that, but I think it'll be okay. And if it comes through a little blurry or whatever, you should be able to hear me. So, all right. So, hello everyone. How you doing? Mr. Mummaw here, coming at you again, talking about American history. It's kind of fun doing broadcasting. I feel like you guys help me go viral with this. I can talk about history, extremist political views, whatever you want me to say, I'll talk about it. What I'm talking you guys, what I'm talking about with you today, is the war in the Pacific. Now we talked about the war in Europe. We talked about how that went, the fall of Nazi Germany, Hitler committing suicide, and all that. At the same time that's going on, there is that war also being fought in the Pacific theater. And we talked about that idea of a theater, I believe, that a sort of location where a certain aspect of the war is being fought, and that helps kind of schematize the war, helps you understand what's going on in all these different areas. So a theater is kind of like a mini war within a larger war. World War II is the largest war in history. It involves tens of millions of men fighting all over the world. So it's pretty involved. So if you can break it down to little parts, it's a little easier to kind of keep track of what's going on. Now, to begin with, first thing I want to talk about is the Empire of Japan. We talked about Japan. We talked about the Great Depression, how the Empire of Japan is the Empire of Japan has expanded into China. Empire of Japan has expanded out in the Pacific. When the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Empire of Japan has expanded out into the basically into the Pacific. And into the Pacific, you have the Japanese occupying islands over millions of square miles. A massive, massive empire on the map that just covers just a huge swath of the Pacific Ocean. Now, this includes places that are important for the Japanese, like the Philippines and Indonesia and places like that, but also very tiny islands, some of which were uninhabited before the Japanese showed up. Well, this whole area, the parts of Asia the Japanese take over, this is the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. It's kind of the Japanese understanding of their empire. The idea is we're Europeans, and now it's us Asians running things in our own interest and for prosperity for all. In actuality, of course, it's about prosperity for Japan. And really not even that. The Japanese empire is, it's not really turning a profit for them or anything. And in fact, the military rationale for it is kind of limited. We talked about this, the Japanese, the army basically, they do what they want. It doesn't make any sense for an empire that's already having a hard time keeping fuel and supplies and everything going. Japan doesn't produce these things. To occupy millions of square miles of ocean, having to ship supplies to all these thousands of tiny islands. The empire is a major liability for them. In fact, when they asked Yamamoto, the naval commander, what can you do? He said, well, give me 6 months and I will just roll over everything. After that, I don't know. And that's pretty much exactly what happens. Now, the United States' response to Pearl Harbor, when the United States finally gets drawn in its attack on Pearl Harbor, is pretty immediate. The Doolittle raid. James Doolittle actually apparently trained right here in the Columbia area. I was not aware of that, and my students told me. They flooded to create Lake Murray, but apparently they had a training area there, and that's where they were doing stuff. The Doolittle raid is a raid on Japan in the immediate aftermath of the attack on Pearl Harbor. One thing about the Doolittle raid is it's not a military attack per se. The Doolittle raid just involves a few American bombers taking off from an aircraft carrier, dropping bombs on Tokyo, and then flying on to China. The symbolic value of this, though, is important. Let the Japanese know we're not taking this lying down. Let the Americans know we are not taking this lying down. Being able to launch bombers off an aircraft carrier was unprecedented. An airplane, if you guys know, needs a lot of space to build up speed before it takes off. And you can't really do that with a bomber on an aircraft carrier. It's just not big enough. So what they did was stripped everything they possibly could out of these bombers, guns, armor, everything. So they were really weakened, and they flew and dropped their bombs and landed in China. And that's, well, a couple of them, some of them got captured, but they landed in China, and the raid was a big morale booster in America. Now, the actual big military part of it is going to come a little bit later. Remember, Roosevelt's priority is Europe. The Pacific Theater is initially going to be something that's defensive. Now, right off the bat, America they're already mad about what happened at Pearl Harbor. It was seen as a treacherous attack. And what makes it even madder are atrocities like the Bataan Death March. The Japanese attack the Philippines just as fast as they attack Hawaii. They swoop in, catch all these Americans basically unaware, capture a whole bunch of them. And then for reasons of efficient prisoner upkeep, they march these prisoners. Again, it's being kind of weird. I'll go with it. Okay. um, but let me know. Feel free to, and guys, if you have questions, jump in on the chat. If you're curious about something, if I need to elaborate on something a little bit more, please ask, because it's very important that we're clear about everything. I really enjoy doing this. I think it's fun, but understand from my perspective, I can't see you at all, so I have no idea if you guys are, what you're doing. I can't see you, so the only way you're going to be able to get to me is by the chat. So if you can do that, great. Now, in the Bataan Death March, the racism, a tremendous amount of racism. You're going to see all kinds of atrocities on both sides involved in this. Now, with that Bataan Death March, one guy involved in that on the American side is a guy named Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur is in command of the Philippines. He's taken by surprise just like everybody else. And MacArthur, he's going to escape the Philippines along with some of his men, makes a very famous vow that he's going to come back. And MacArthur will become the Allied commander in the Pacific. Now, there will always be this tension between MacArthur, the Army, and the Navy and the Marines, who are under the sort of aegis of the Navy at this time, over who's going to be in charge. Inter-service rivalry. It's a feature of war then, it's a feature of war now. The Navy wants stuff, the Army wants stuff, the Marines want stuff, the Air Force, which is going to come later, wants stuff, and so there is kind of this bureaucratic battle these guys will have with each other. Now, MacArthur, we're going to talk about him and the strategy of island hopping coming up. Now, initially, like I said, you get this idea of a defensive war in the Pacific. That's going to change, largely due to the efforts of a guy named Chester Nimitz. Chester Nimitz is the naval commander in the Pacific. He's an admiral. And Nimitz advocates a strategy of taking the war to the Japanese. One thing the Americans have an advantage over the Japanese in is our code breaking. The Americans have broken the Japanese military codes and are able to basically listen in to the Japanese communicating with each other, and they know where the Japanese are. So it's and this is true throughout the war. It's a major intelligence advantage, and this will give people like Nimitz confidence that even though our Navy is relatively untested compared to the Japanese, we can take the fight to them. And this leads to two major naval battles, the Battle of Coral Sea and the Battle of Midway. Coral Sea and Midway in May and June of 1942 are huge naval battles that really start the reverse of Japanese success in the Pacific. A lot of interesting things about Coral Sea and Midway. One, the ships never see each other. This battle is fought over thousands of miles of 1,000 square miles of terrain, of ocean, I should say, not terrain. Airplanes, basically, I'm summing up something really complicated, really simply. Fighter planes, torpedo bombers take off from the Japanese ships, attack the American ships. They get defeated. American planes take off, attack the Japanese ships, and sink a bunch of them. In both battles, they're fought by airplanes attacking ships, not ships shooting at each other with big cannons. The era of the battleship is slowly fading out. Now we don't even use them anymore. But the era of the battleship is slowly fading out. The future is air and submarines in naval warfare. And this is really an early glimpse of that. Well, after the two victories of Coral Sea and Midway, the United States moves on to its first land campaign in the Pacific, and that is liberating the Solomon Islands in the Guadalcanal campaign. Guadalcanal is fought for about 6 months. The United States Army and Marines attack Guadalcanal after a big naval bombardment and spend about 6 months getting rid of the Japanese. Now, Guadalcanal is important for a lot of reasons. One, it's the start of that island hopping campaign. The United States, Douglas MacArthur is going to advocate this idea of island hopping. The United States moves from island to island to island as it needs to get closer and closer to Japan. The goal of island hopping being to get close enough to Japan to launch bombers from islands and bomb Japan directly. And this will be the strategy the United States follows, and in fact, it will be a successful strategy. Now, it doesn't involve attacking every island the Japanese are on. Sometimes you just bypass islands that are of no strategic value, and the Japanese soldiers on those islands are basically starved to death because they can't be resupplied, and a tropical island can't support any but a very tiny number of people, depending on where resources are available, but it's never going to be a large population, especially not a bunch of soldiers. Also, Guadalcanal, the Americans get a taste of Japanese military tactics directly for an extended period of time. The Japanese military doctrine is very different than American military doctrine. They frown enormously on surrender. There's this idea of you fight to the death. Japanese will fight to the death even after they're clearly going to lose, and in sort of the Western style of warfare, you would surrender. As far as the Japanese are concerned, you just keep going. Japanese will use tactics like hiding grenades on their person when they're surrendering and then blowing up themselves and whoever's capturing them, hiding grenades under people who are injured and they roll them over to check them, blows up. Stuff like that, stuff that's really not a part of the Western idea of what constitutes legitimate warfare. So Americans are really appalled by a lot of this, and it feeds into some of the negative stereotypes they already have about Asians. And it's one of the things that's going to make the war in the Pacific really, really bloody. One other note about the Solomon Islands. I read a book, a really good book called, actually, hold on one second. I always like to recommend books. Sorry, camera there. The Happy Isles of Oceania by Paul Thoreau. It's a really good book. And in the book, Paul Thoreau actually, he goes from island to island, and he visits the Solomons. And when he's there, it's in 1991 when the Gulf War is about to have America's first, we liberate Kuwait from Saddam Hussein. And the people on the island, they had heard about this war that was going to take place, and they were terrified because they figured the Iraqis and the Americans were going to come back to their island to fight it out because that's just what these guys do. Understand this from the perspective of the native peoples of these islands. Most of them live a relatively primitive material existence. They fish and farm and stuff like that. And then all of a sudden here comes the Japanese military just sweeping through the island, taking over everything, and then the Americans show up and they fight these massive titanic battles with bombs and airplanes and everything, and then they just kind of go away. And if you're one of the people who actually live there, you're just, what just happened? That's crazy. So they're really, as far as they're concerned, let me check my email real quick here and make sure everything's good. As far as they're concerned, I guess everybody just fights their wars here now. It's just what they do. So as far as, so they're really worried about that. Fortunately for them, the United States fought in Kuwait. Not so fortunate, I guess, for the Kuwaitis. One thing to know about all this, though, to keep in mind, it's kind of humorous a little bit, but the native people, the civilians on these islands, suffer way disproportionately compared to the Americans and the Japanese. And when I talk about a battle where 5,000 people die, 5,000 soldiers die, understand that means something like 25,000 to 50,000 civilians die. They're the ones who are caught in the middle. People have no interest in this conflict. People have no stake in this conflict. The people who are just there. Japanese murder civilians. They force civilians to fight. Americans drop bombs when strategy demands it, not necessarily worrying about who's there. So in this war, like in any war, it's the non-combatants who die in disproportionate numbers to the soldiers who die. And those numbers, the actual combatants dying, is pretty high anyway. So there are a lot of really bad things that happen here. Now, island hopping moves forward, and there's a lot of these battles. You could spend an entire semester just talking about the war in the Pacific, all the small battles on all these islands. I didn't talk about Wake Island. I didn't talk about Tarawa. I mean, there's so many things I could mention. Saipan is a good example of the kind of tactics the Japanese use. Battle of Saipan, 30,000 Japanese soldiers there when the Americans show up. By the end, there are between 930 and 940 Japanese who are actually taken prisoner. So you're talking about, I'm not really good at math, but you're over 90% casualties, are dead, not wounded, dead. The Japanese fought to the death. When they ran out of bullets, human wave attacks with swords and bayonets. The Americans were just appalled by this. They couldn't understand why these people just would not surrender when they were clearly outmatched. And this is something, by late 1942, the Japanese High Command must have known this war was unwinnable. There's not going to be any way to stop this American industrial juggernaut coming through. They don't have the resources to hold the Americans back, and yet they just keep fighting. And as far as the Americans are concerned, there's just something unjust about this. Why do we still have to be here fighting you? Why won't you just give up? You can't win. And again, this feeds into a lot of the hatred that you're going to see throughout this war. One thing I will mention also, and you can look this up online if you want to see pictures of it, or I guess I'll send the PowerPoint and everything. Americans on these campaigns begin taking trophies. Now, looting is a part of any war. You'll see soldiers take flags and personal items off dead enemies. My grandfather, who fought in World War II, came home with a Luger pistol, a 9mm pistol. And he didn't say where he got it, but it clearly must have been something either he or somebody else got off a dead body and he got a hold of. You're not supposed to do that. Looting, taking stuff from dead bodies or civilians or anything is illegal. You will be prosecuted in military court for that. However, it happens a lot. It happens in every war. It's happening as we speak. In Afghanistan, in Iraq, it's just a part of, it's what soldiers do when, when they're left to their own devices. It's just something, I guess, instinctive in the human mind. You shoot somebody and take their stuff. Goes back to the Iliad. But in the War in the Pacific, it goes to another dimension where you actually have people taking human trophies, which is to say body parts, people's gold teeth, people's hands, tattoos. If a guy has an interesting tattoo, you just cut it off, pull it off, and let it just dry out to where it's like leather. And then you actually get the phenomenon of people actually taking heads. You cut off someone's head. There's no axes or anything. You just saw it with a bayonet or something. And then you put it in a net, drag it behind the ship, and the fish eat all the stuff off, the little fish that follow the ships around. And then you just take it, and it's pretty much cleaned off, and you polish it, and you got a skull. There's a famous photo from Life magazine where a woman is sitting looking at a skull her husband sent her, her boyfriend sent her from the Pacific. And this isn't somebody's photo that he found in somebody's album somewhere. It's published in Life magazine. And there has to be a certain level of acceptance from the public where Life magazine is comfortable putting a picture of average American girl looking at her desk with a skull sitting on it, not in horror, but just, oh, my boyfriend, how nice, he sent me this. Things like that don't happen unless the people surrounding it approve of it. Now, the Army, this was illegal, and soldiers who were caught doing this were prosecuted, but the practice was so widespread, there must have been some level of official toleration of it. So it's really very nasty stuff that's going on in the Pacific. And so the war progresses. Now, as the Americans move through these islands going north, they finally make it to the Philippines. They fight the Battle of Leyte Gulf, which is the largest naval battle probably in history. And at the Battle of Leyte Gulf in the southern Pacific, the Japanese Navy is utterly annihilated. It's destroyed. They have some ships left back in Japan, but the forward Navy that's actually out fighting is basically destroyed at this point. One other significant thing about Leyte Gulf is in response to the fact that they're reduced to ever more desperate tactics, the Japanese began launching the famous kamikaze attacks. Kamikaze, the word actually means something like divine wind. It refers to the typhoon that destroyed a fleet of, Kublai Khan sent Mongols to invade Japan, and a big hurricane or typhoon destroyed all these ships. And so in Japanese history, Japanese, their idea about what's going to save their country, kamikaze, divine wind, is going to keep out the invaders. And a kamikaze is basically just a guy who gets in an airplane. The airplane's loaded down with bombs to the point where the guy's got grenades in his lap. And he flies his plane deliberately toward a ship and crashes into it, killing himself, but with all the bombs. Basically, it's a guided missile that just can, if you hit the ship right at the waterline, it can sink it. And in fact, they do sink ships successfully. American tactics aren't geared toward shooting people who don't care if they get shot. They're just coming straight at you. They're used to shooting at people who are trying to, get away and live. So initially, these are relatively successful. However, they're obviously wasteful of trained pilots, of airplanes, and if they're not successful, then you've really wasted a lot of material. But this is a feature for the remainder of the war, these kamikaze attacks. And they will also use boats and things for this. Load up a boat and just crash into the ship. The planes, though, are what linger in the public's imagination. That horrible spectacle of a man just sitting in a plane crash landing into the deck of a ship. I read one account where a guy smashed the deck of the ship, this huge flaming wreck, and they're trying to put out the fire, and people are jumping in the plane, and they're cutting this guy's tattoos off while he's still alive, burning to death. Just horrible, horrible stuff that's going on. And again, it just kind of goes to show how bad these things are. The Philippines campaign follows after Leyte Gulf. Americans march through, they liberate the Philippines. Douglas MacArthur is able to redeem his promise of returning. With the liberation of the Philippines now, the war is very clearly shifted entirely in favor of America. There's really no way the Japanese are going to push the Americans back at this point, having taken the Philippines. And this is, the war in the Pacific already has big stories and important points in American history that people look back on the war in the Pacific. Wow, that's memorable, that's important. But probably nothing from the Pacific is more important in terms of symbolism than the Battle of Iwo Jima. Iwo Jima is an uninhabited volcanic rock in the middle of just between Japan, it's kind of hard to describe, kind of by Japan, by the Philippines, kind of in that area. It's uninhabited before the Japanese and Americans show up, but it's in a strategic location, so the Japanese occupy it, and the Americans show up to fight them off. Well, during this battle, the Americans attack and they take the heights called Mount Suribachi. And on Mount Suribachi, they raise a big flag. And that flag raising, you see the video of it, you see photos of it. They made a statue out of it, probably more than one statue. It is a big feature of American self-conception of the 20th century. This idea that we're victorious, we planted our flag on this foreign territory in war. We defeated the Japanese, this empire that's never been successfully invaded. We're doing that. A lot of controversy about the flag raising. There's some dispute about which people were involved. There's actually two flags that got raised. One got raised and the flag got taken away. And then another guy, then they raised the flag, and which guys were involved in which raising. If you're interested in a very good movie about, or a pair of movies actually, about the Battle of Iwo Jima, there is Clint Eastwood's Flags of Our Fathers and Letters from Iwo Jima. Flags of Our Fathers is from the American point of view. It's about the flag raising and the aftermath, where the guys who raised the flag, maybe, are put on tour basically to raise money for the war effort, and they have to reenact this flag raising. And it deals with a lot of the issues that soldiers face, where we're in America comfortable raising this flag and raising money while our friends are off dying. It's kind of guilt, survivor's guilt. It's a very, very good movie. And then Letters from Iwo Jima is from the Japanese perspective. Ken Watanabe plays the Japanese commander on the island. And he goes out there, and the soldiers have been told, the Japanese soldiers and the Japanese people, we're winning, we're winning, we're winning, we're holding the Americans back, we're doing good. But he knows the truth, that he has been sent out there to die, along with all of his men. And the movie is about how he deals with that, how he keeps the fight going, despite the fact that he knows he's never coming back. So both of these are very good films, very powerful movies. If you're interested in this, watch those. So from Iwo Jima, the next logical step, if you look at the map, is an attack on the island of Okinawa. Okinawa is significant because Okinawa is actually in Japanese home territory. Now, the Okinawans are not Japanese. They're a different ethnic group. They're ruled by Japan, but they have their own language. Now it's going away, but they have their own language. They are not Japanese. They don't really have any real big stake in this. Nonetheless, because it's technically Japanese territory, the Japanese are going to fight even harder than they've been fighting to defend this. The Battle of Okinawa is probably the bloodiest battle of the Pacific, especially in relative terms and absolute terms. 5,000 American dead. Untold numbers of the estimates of Japanese and civilian dead are just, I've read everything from, it's hard to really, I've read something like 50,000 dead Japanese. I don't know if that's accurate. There's just different ways to calculate it, but the number of civilians was horrible. And one really bad thing about the civilian deaths is that the Japanese had told the local people, if the Americans show up and they defeat us, you're going to be all raped and murdered, and they're going to just wipe out the whole population. And people committed mass suicide to avoid this, to avoid being raped and murdered, tortured to death, basically by the Americans. And the Americans had to convince people, hey, we're not going to do that. Also, the Japanese took middle school kids. They armed anybody they could possibly arm on this island and forced them to fight. The Americans were fighting 12 and 13-year-olds who didn't even want to be there. The Battle of Okinawa the fighting was absolutely savage. And like World War I type stuff, body parts rising out of the mud, desperate hand-to-hand fighting for days and days and weeks, horrible fighting. And all this stuff gets in the American newspapers, and it really hardens America's resolve to punish Japan. You see, we talked about this, right? The word Jap appearing and nip. Things were racial slurs even in the 1940s that would otherwise never see print in a respectable newspaper or all over the place. Generals and admirals are quoted advocating atrocities that the public doesn't really think negatively of. People, I'm going to make Japanese a language only spoken in hell, and the idea of we're going to wipe these people out. And this doesn't arouse a tremendous amount of public disapproval. And the fact that there is this attitude going into it colors a lot of what Americans will do later. For example, when finally we're now in range with Iwo Jima and Okinawa and all this, we're in range of bombing Japan directly, we have to decide how we're going to do it. Now, they drop bombs like in Germany at first. Germany, though, is different than Japan in terms of their infrastructure. The factories are more densely put together, so dropping a conventional bomb blows things up and is pretty effective. In Japan, things are spread out. There's still a lot of home industry, so dropping conventional bombs doesn't have the same effect it's going to have in Germany. However, one thing about Japanese architecture, one thing characteristic of Japanese architecture is that they use a lot of light wood and paper. In traditional Japanese houses, a lot of the interior walls are just going to be wooden frames basically with paper on them, screens, not even really walls. And paper and light wood are very flammable. So Curtis LeMay, Army Air Corps general, gets the idea to firebomb Japan. If we just drop incendiaries, bombs that light things on fire as opposed to just exploding, this will have a much greater effect. And that's what they do. They fly over Japan and drop these firebombs. Now, when they drop these firebombs, the fires are so intense they create something called a firestorm, where you actually have the air gets so hot it rises and it sucks in air from outside. And if you're in a certain area, this can actually suffocate you because the air is just pulled out of your area. You just have to breathe. People aren't even injured, just fall over dead. The firestorms, the temperatures are so hot, streets melt, sand turns to glass. Babies on backs catch on fire, wrapped in cloth. They just combust. People die by the thousands. Civilians, people have nothing to do with the war, just bombs dropped on them. And it just kind of goes to show how things, war's just kind of morally corrosive process. Things that seem really horrible at the beginning of a war, by the middle, getting close to the end, just make a lot of very terrible sense. Despite the firebombing, though, the Japanese don't surrender. Japanese high command does not surrender. And so now the American military has to plan, well, we've taken everything else. The next logical step, invade Japan. And this is Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan. Now, we know about the atomic bomb, we know how it ended. But at the time, no one in the Army, except at the very, 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 very top, knows this stuff. The president and his advisor, that's it. So the Army's planning this, the military's planning this on the understanding that it's going to be a conventional type of invasion. Now, the way Japan is set up, Japan is a very mountainous island. There aren't a lot of places where soldiers can hit a beach and land, and we know that, and the Japanese know that, so we know where they're going to concentrate their defenses because they know where we're going to attack, which means the element of surprise is pretty much pointless. It's not going to matter in this. The Japanese have still, a lot of soldiers in reserve they kept in Japan. They've armed the civilian population. They still have kamikaze planes ready to go. They beach their battleships to fight off, just use basically shore batteries to attack Americans. The plan is basically, there's different variations on this, but the basic idea is we attack Kyushu, which is the southernmost island, bomb it into just oblivion, pave over a large part of it, and just use that to launch bombers into Japan, maybe for another year. Then the largest amphibious invasion in history. Something between 500,000 and a million American casualties, something between 5 and 10 million dead Japanese, and this theoretically could go on into the 1950s. So that's what you're looking at planning-wise when it comes time to consider the atomic bomb. The atomic bomb is, at this point, the most powerful weapon ever built by a human being, and they'll build things more powerful. We'll talk about that when we talk about the Cold War. The atomic bomb basically involves, the theory of it was around since the 1920s or maybe even earlier, where if you take a very heavy atom, something like uranium, and you fire a proton at it, cause that atom to split. Well, that atom splits, kind of like a shooting pool, breaks up the triangle, boom, breaks it up, and so all the constituent parts of the atom fly everywhere and bust up other atoms and so on, creating a chain reaction. The forces that hold these atoms together are tremendous. So releasing that energy releases a tremendous amount of energy. And so you can weaponize this. Now, the problem is to build a bomb like that, you would have to get the smartest people in the world together in one place and give them unlimited money. So in the 1920s, it's not really feasible. In the 1940s, that's exactly what the government does. They get the smartest people in the world to put them in one place and just write them a blank check and say, make this atomic bomb. So they come up with this bomb, and they test it out in the desert in Los Alamos in July of 1945. And up to this point, these scientists who've been working on this thing, it's all theoretical. They've seen this on paper. They have some idea what's going to happen. But when they actually see it go off, when they see it explode with the force of 22,000 tons of TNT, they're just all silent. They can't... Seeing what they've actually created is just staggering, and not really much to say. Later on, Robert Oppenheimer, who's in charge of all this, will say, he said, quoted from the Bhagavad Gita, he taught himself Sanskrit because he felt like learning that, because that's what you do when you're a genius. Now I am, behold the radiance of 1,000 suns, now I am become as death, the destroyer of worlds, because that's really what they've done. And, they got to decide what to do. And by they, I mean the president. And by president, I mean Harry Truman. Truman was Roosevelt's vice president in his last term. Everybody close to Roosevelt realized Roosevelt ran 4 times and got elected 4 times. But by term number 4, he is a very, very sick man, and it's very clear he will not live out his term. So whoever's going to be vice president is basically going to be president. The public don't know this, but the insiders do. Harry Truman replaces Henry Wallace, who had been the previous vice president because he's felt to be too close to Stalin. He was kind of a fan of Stalin. And so Truman, who's this basically small-town guy from Missouri, last president to not have a college education. He was a high school education, went to work in a hardware store, did some other little small businessman, got into local politics and just kind of worked his way up to being a senator, at which point he's brought into the Roosevelt campaign, vice president. Roosevelt dies, and now this guy, Mr. Small-Town America, Mr. just regular guy with an average American education, average American outlook, now has more power in his hand than history's greatest conquerors. Napoleon, Alexander the Great, nobody had this. He has the power to wipe out a city, a hardware store owner from Missouri. And so he's got to decide, well, do I write 500,000 condolence letters, or do I unleash the doomsday weapon? Well, in all these firebombing campaigns, the Americans purposely were ordered not to bomb 4 cities: Kyoto, Kokura, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki. Basically because the people at the top realized they needed a fresh canvas, for lack of a better word, for what they were going to do. So we're going to use the first bomb. They got 2 bombs ready. They're going to use the first one. And they got to decide between Kyoto and Hiroshima. Of all weird things, Harry Stimson, Secretary of War, had been to Kyoto several times. He spent his honeymoon in Kyoto, and he thought it was pretty. So he said, nope, not Kyoto. And just like that, Kyoto lives, Hiroshima dies. They drop an atomic bomb over Hiroshima. 100,000 people die. Just dead, just like that. That's August 6th. The Japanese don't surrender. So, plane flies out. August 9th, Kokura or Nagasaki. Well, they fly to Kokura, but it's a cloudy day. The cameras can't get a good angle on what they're doing, and they definitely want to record this. So they leave Kokura, and just like that, Kokura lives, and Nagasaki dies. They bomb Nagasaki, kill 80,000 people, including wiping out basically Japan's only remaining Christian community from when the shoguns tried to wipe it out. Still, the Japanese do not surrender. It's not until August 15th that the emperor finally says, look, guys, we got to hang it up. For his own good, his men try to assassinate him because it's better than to kill the emperor and let him dishonor himself with surrender. But he manages to survive and smuggles a tape out and says, guys, we're done. It's over. And Japan surrenders. That's the end of World War II in the Pacific and the end of World War II in general. One final note I will make about this, and you can look this guy up. There was a guy, his name just completely slipped my mind. I don't know why. You can look him up, though. It's pretty easy to find. Oh, Yamaguchi, sorry. Guy named Yamaguchi. Yamaguchi is on a business trip to Hiroshima, August 6, 1945. They dropped an atomic bomb on him. He survives, lives through this atomic bomb. And then a couple days later, goes back home to Nagasaki, where, as he puts it, he's in his workplace telling his boss what happened, saying, they dropped a bomb on Hiroshima, blew it up. He says, no, one bomb can't do that. And he's looking out the window, and he sees the other atomic bomb going off. Bomb blew him up. He survived that one too. This man had 2 atomic bombs dropped on him. He's the only guy that happened to that they can verify. So when you have an atomic bomb dropped on you, you're probably thinking, wow, that's the worst thing that could ever happen to me. My life's smooth sailing. And then 2 days later, they drop another bomb on you. So pretty bad. Now, he lived to be 93, and as you can imagine, was a peace activist. Please stop dropping bombs on me. It's not, I'm not laughing like it's funny they dropped these bombs, but I mean just the luck you have to have for that to happen. Yes. Oof. All right, so anyone have any questions? Put them in the chat. We good? Anybody? Let me make sure no emails. We good? Okay, all right. So I'm assuming everybody can hear me okay, and everybody has everything, so I'm not getting any response. So thank you all for listening. I had fun, and I really like doing these broadcasts. So if you have any questions, email me, ask Ms. McCall. And thank you, Ms. McCall, for all your hard work. Oh, wait, you can't see me. Yeah. Thank you, Ms. McCall, for all your hard work. You guys have, I don't know, is your spring break next week? If your spring break's next week, have a nice spring break. It's my spring break, so I'll be out, but I can obviously answer emails or anything like that. And if you're not on spring break, I'll be coming back up to make a video just for you guys. So thanks for watching. I will see you guys later, and have fun.